It is a matter long debated. Is progress better served by war or by peace? Today, we're going to look for the answer in this map.
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fellow said. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Holly.
There's a lot of truth to what Harry Lime says, and today's map is a marvelous study in the interplay between war and progress. It's a map from 1863 that describes a specific technology, one of the most important inventions of the century, an invention that changed international relations, trade, and even literature and culture for the better. An invention that allowed ideas and information to crisscross the world in an afternoon. The submarine telegraph cable. Our map was first published in the pages of the Weekly Dispatch magazine, and then again in atlas form. It covers the Mediterranean Sea and shows every undersea cable laid to that date. There aren't many. It also includes steamship lines, but we're a couple decades into this age of steam, and this is much less interesting. We're going to take a close look at it and use what we know of history to decide for ourselves how close Harry Lime was to the truth. Which moves technology further, the exigencies of war or the pursuits of peaceful profit? While we're at it, we'll evaluate the map itself for its position in the cartographic history and its general collectability. That's what we do here on the Eye of History. We look both at the history on the map and the history of the map. And if you enjoy seeing the world from new and interesting vantages, then like, share, and subscribe. It really helps wonky channels like this one. Most books and videos that talk about undersea telegraphy start and finish with the first transatlantic cable. Maybe because most books and videos are coming from America, or perhaps because it's the most spectacular example. But the reason probably isn't that it was a very expensive failure. That was in 1858. At that time, it took 2,000 volts for the signal to reach across the Atlantic, which outstripped the capacity of the materials available at the time. It didn't last a month. The proper place to start was 7 years earlier, in 1851, when the English Channel was successfully bridged. It took 3 tries. Over the next few years, cables were being laid from Britain to every island and continental point they could reach, which wasn't very far. At that time, Ireland and Belgium were the limit for length. It was almost entirely a British endeavor, British companies hiring British boats to lay British-made cable. Other than a few cables laid around Denmark, it was in the Mediterranean Sea that we first see truly international interests and the application of submarine telegraphy to war. Our map covers this first decade of development. We'll see the first cables built specifically for military purposes. We'll also see some of the most ambitious commercial projects. It's an amazing visual reference, a snapshot of technological progress at a critical moment in time. Let's look at it in detail. To start, we're going to look at a cable that's not on our map. About 10 years before this map was made, there was a particularly nasty war in an unlikely corner of Europe, the Crimean Peninsula. The war pitted Russia against Britain, France, the Ottoman Empire, and, for some reason, Sardinia. It was an astonishing enterprise, the greatest expeditionary war in history to that date. Britain and France fielding armies in a theater 1,000+ miles away, striking not at a distant colony, but directly at the flank of another major power, and was made more complicated by the politics of this unlikely alliance. Communications were obviously going to be crucial, but getting messages to and from the Crimea was tough. The telegraph lines could send messages across Austria in a few hours, but those cables ended at the Black Sea. Getting messages across the sea to the troops on the peninsula could take weeks. The solution was to lay a cable across the Black Sea. 2 years into the war, the British accomplished the feat, connecting the Ottoman port of Varna to the peninsula. Now messages took less than a day to get from London and Paris to the front. The war ended just about a year after the cable was completed, and official reports credited the cable for shortening the war significantly. But unofficially, the commanders hated it. After the cable was completed, it took just 2 weeks before the French commander resigned in frustration, as ill-informed orders began coming in from Paris. The British commander was inundated with demands from countless departments back in London, and he had no staff to handle the incessant requests. No general before had ever been so connected to the Home Office, and it was reported that the general spent virtually every waking moment responding to all of these requests personally. Regardless of its effectiveness, as soon as the war was over, the cable failed. But a second cable, linking Varna to Constantinople, did survive and is on this map. At the same time as France was fighting in the Crimea, they were also in the middle of a decades-long conflict in Algeria. France had invaded Algiers in 1830 in an attempt to extinguish the Barbary pirates that had been preying on European shipping for generations. The war was a brutal series of campaigns that unfolded over 40 years. And inevitably, the French government wanted a cable to connect Paris to the battleground. In 1854, links between Spezia in Italy were completed to Corsica in Sardinia. Interestingly, the remaining link was not financed by the French Telegraph Company, but by a new and completely private company, the Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company. The Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company had a simple business plan. It would piggyback on the networks that the government-backed companies were building, and we'll see much more of this company later. Unfortunately, the ship laying the Algeria link played the cable out too fast, and it failed. It is, though, still on this map, marked as a failed cable. That's one of the things I love about this map, is how it preserves the history even of the failures. The Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company survived their initial failure in Algeria, and in 1857 they laid cable from Sardinia to Malta, and from there, Corfu. Malta was an obvious target, as the Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company was a British company, and Malta was an important hub for the British fleet. It was also a stepping stone towards the ultimate goal, Suez. Construction on the Suez Canal would not start for another 2 years, but it pays to be prepared. Corfu might seem like a strange choice for a destination. It's an island with only about 20,000 people, but since the Napoleonic Wars, it was the property of Great Britain. War in Italy was imminent. It would break out again in 1859, and Corfu surely seemed like a safe haven from which to monitor the Adriatic Sea, as well as Greece and the Ottoman Empire. The Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company was clearly seeing the British Navy as a key customer. In 1859, they added Sicily to the network. However, the link to Sardinia failed that same year. The Corfu line would also fail 2 years later in 1861, which shows what a risky business this was to be in. In this era, only Britain had the stock market and pool of ready investors to finance such risky schemes. Today, we hear echoes of this in the literature of the era. Stories by Trollope and Dickens and others of fortunes made and lost in stock speculation. Those authors usually identify speculation with swindling and promotion with fraud. But many of those so-called speculations supported real businesses. Real and legitimately risky. It was the British investors' collective tolerance for risk that led Britain build and benefit from 2 empires. First, the smaller one that it conquered by force of arms, and second, a larger one that it built with telegraphs, steamships, and railways. Only Britain had the pool of ready, risk-tolerant investors and a stock market with the sophistication to pull off these types of risky investments which created an incredible commercial empire. In addition to these longer lines, a few short spans were crossed in this era. One line in 1855 was stretched across the Straits of Messina to connect Sicily to the mainland Italy. That line failed, but a new line was laid in 1858. This second line was interesting in that it was the first line laid by a non-British ship. In 1859, the Spanish government financed a line across the Straits of Gibraltar. Both of these lines, of course, make it on our map. An interesting network in the Aegean Sea appeared in 1859, financed by the government of Greece. Greece had won its independence from the Ottoman Empire just a couple decades earlier in the 1820s. What is surprising is that this network, financed by the Greek government, extends to two islands that were still in the grip of the Ottoman Empire: Candia, what we call Greek today, and Chios, located on an island on the Turkish side of the Aegean. During the War for Independence, Chios had been brutalized by the Ottomans. Many had fled the island, creating a diaspora in places like London and Constantinople. Now, the Chiots, like many such dispersed groups, found a good living as merchants, taking advantage of their dispersion. And it was a propitious time to enter the shipping business, as steamships were just beginning to come into use. And where did steam have the greatest advantage over sail? Not in the open ocean, where ships have plenty of leeway to find a favorable wind, but in the confines of seas like the Mediterranean. The Chiots in London could raise investments and buy engines and ships. Remember what I just said about the presence of a London stock market and investors who could tolerate risk. Well, the Chiots were able to tap into that financial system. And with Chiots spread across the Mediterranean, they had the connections to work deals in every port. They came to be the leading force in the new generation of steam-based merchantry. So though the Aegean cables were backed by the Greek government in Athens, they clearly were directed to the benefit of the Chiot merchants. We know just a little bit about the Aegean lines from old business records, a few of which survived into the 1980s. And in the description below, you'll find a website that preserves most of the history that could be gleaned from those records. That website was my primary source in making this video. Now, every cable listed on that website is shown on this map. And the site includes additional details wherever available. But there's one cable on this map that's not listed on this site. And in fact, this map may be the only remaining record of this particular cable. The cable runs from Chios to some point on the Sea of Marmara, probably Gallipoli. Presumably from there, a landline connected it to Constantinople, where a Chiot colony existed. Needless to say, I sent a scan of this map to the webmaster, who verified that this cable had been completely lost to history. Moving on to 1859, construction had now begun on the Suez Canal, and the need for a cable to connect Europe to Egypt was becoming acute. A new competitor to the Mediterranean Extension Company appeared with an ambitious idea. They were going to lay a cable directly between Candia, that is Crete, and Alexandria. They tried twice, the first time laying 150 nautical miles of cable before they failed, the second time nearly twice as much. They would have needed to double that distance again to succeed, and they had to give up. Had they succeeded, it would have been a tremendous business, the first real Africa to Europe link. It was a bold endeavor, and unfortunately a failure. Meanwhile, a number of less ambitious projects were appearing around the Mediterranean. In the Balearics, the Spanish government linked up all the islands in a loop. The benefit of a loop being that in the event of any single break, the islands were still accessible. The Italian government financed a line to connect Italy with Albania, which was at this time still a part of the Ottoman Empire. And when the Corfu line from Malta failed, the Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company replaced it with a much shorter line directly from Corfu to Italy. One thing that makes this map particularly interesting is that it shows the broken lines as well as the operational ones. Now, this map was originally released in a magazine. It was made by newsmen, not academic geographers. and was likely that every one of the projects on this map was at one time the subject of a story in the magazine. This newsman's perspective makes this map all the more valuable for the historian. Another example of the failures being as interesting as the successes was the ambitious attempt to connect France with Algeria. We saw before France's first attempt to get a direct connection to Algeria, and they did not give up on that ambition. In 1861, the National Telegraphy Company was again tasked with making that link happen. It was a daunting task, by far the most ambitious yet in the Mediterranean. The first attempt failed, but the cable layers were at least able to salvage it as far as Minorca. A second attempt was a complete loss, and the project was abandoned. And the Minorca line, it failed soon after. This map shows the link as a functioning line. It's one of the few mistakes that I've been able to find. Now, while the French were feeding the sea with copper and gutta percha in the west, the British had an even greater ambition in the east. In 1861, with work on the Suez Canal well underway, the British revived the idea of getting a telegraphic link directly to Egypt. They first tried land routes, but they ran into an unsolvable problem. The nomadic natives kept cutting the lines. Perhaps this was a strategic move by the Berbers and Arabs against their Ottoman overlords, or perhaps they simply wanted the copper. Regardless, the British needed a route that camels and horses couldn't reach. The solution was to lay the cable just offshore. First, a cable from Malta to Tripoli was laid. This was the only deep water portion of the line. Then cables were laid along the African shore, from Tripoli to Benghazi to Alexandria. It worked. Eventually, a new cable directly connecting Malta to Alexandria replaced the coastal line, and in time was extended all the way to Bombay. The company that did that was the successor to the Mediterranean Extension Telegraph Company, a company that would become a global behemoth. So, what did we learn about the role of the military in the development of technology? I think this. We see here and there where countries laid cables largely for military purposes. Spain and the Balearics and Gibraltar, France and Algeria, of course in the Crimea. And then we see the British model, where private companies mostly took the lead, and the state occasionally laid lines for very specific reasons. The private companies clearly were looking to get business from the state, linking places of military importance, but many of the lines were purely speculative. And ultimately, it was the British model that made the most progress. State-driven lines never seemed to grow into anything greater. Only in the Aegean do we see state lines actually expanding, and these lines were built mostly to support private commerce. Now, this isn't an argument for privatizing our military infrastructure. It's just an observation that the military is not a great engine of technical growth. And this applies to government programs in general, like space programs, for the state has little entrepreneurial imagination and little tolerance for risk. It's a plain reality that as great as Britain's military empire was, even more important to British influence and prosperity was its commercial empire. The railways, the telegraphs, the steamships, the banks, the ports, the depots, that grew even in areas that the army never touched. Places like Latin America, where respect for the Monroe Doctrine kept military intervention to a minimum. Now, this map alone doesn't prove the thesis, but it's good evidence, and unlike anything else you will read or hear of today, this map didn't come to the question with an answer in mind. This map just showed us the world as it was seen at the time and allows us to do the analysis. Now, your conclusions might be different than mine. Please, put your ideas into the comments. I'd love to see them. Now to the question of just how collectible is this map. First, let's look at the source. It was first published in a magazine, the Weekly Dispatch, which was a popular British news magazine, liberal and a bit sensationalistic. And for a few years at least, maps like this one were a regular feature. Some of these maps were general maps like maps of countries, and some were useful maps like this one, which clearly was meant to help people plan their trips or to figure out how long the news would take to get to, say, Suez from London. These maps weren't tied to specific news stories. The magazine and the maps were targeted to the self-educated middle-class reader and kind of remind me of the maps that helped make National Geographic the leading magazine of the 20th century. What made this map possible was the development of lithography, a printing technique which allowed maps to be composed of multiple stones, or what we call plates today. These stones could be precisely copied and overlaid. So in this case, they started with a generic map of the Mediterranean. Then they added a cover overlay, a second stone, to give the blue outline to make it easier to see the seas. And then a third stone that had just the cables and steamship lines. We see this most clearly in the legend, where space in the main stone was set aside to be filled in with the new stone with the text showing the submarine telegraph cables. Lithography also made the process of creating the base map much easier, as the map was drawn instead of engraved, and text could be composed and transferred to the stone. And stones could be copied, although that wasn't easy. Once a base map was complete, it could be used to quickly create any number of maps, say showing geological features, or railroads, or the campaigns of a war, all cheaply and quickly enough to be incorporated even into an inexpensive magazine. If our map was just 20 years older, it would be worth quite a bit as an early example of lithography. Sadly, it isn't. It also isn't groundbreaking as a magazine feature, as magazines had been publishing maps using engraving processes for at least a century prior. And our map's not particularly rare. You can find other maps from the Atlas for sale at any time and for modest prices, although trying to find any one specific map is not quite so easy. Occasionally, full atlases appear on the market, typically for under $1,000, and individual maps are generally under $100. But the contents of this map might make it worth quite a bit, but to the right buyer. Undersea cables are still a thing, and the companies that lay them and run them would surely love to have this map hanging in a conference room, the CEO's office, or reception area. Who knows, maybe someone at such a company is watching this video. This is much of the fun and some of the frustration of map collecting. Dedicated map collectors like me are only one part of the market. People also collect maps as part of a topical collection, such as railroad paraphernalia or the history of specific wars like World War II or the Napoleonic Wars or the American Civil War, or particular places like Disneyland or Manhattan. These buyers form a parallel market with their own price structures, which can make it tough for a generalist like me to collect in these areas. But for a map dealer, identifying these markets is an important skill. It's what allows them to take advantage of opportunities to buy a map on the cheap from one group that doesn't value that particular map and selling it dear to another group that does. Unfortunately, I can't really claim that skill for myself. As I've said before, any appraisal I ever give on this channel, you need to take with a huge grain of salt. I am not an appraiser. I'm not a dealer. I'm just a collector. And to me, this map, regardless of what I paid for it, is one of my most valuable. I hope you agree, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, like, share, and subscribe. See you at the next one.